Welcome, folks, to this island-wide public forum for our Martha's Vineyard Road Safety Action Plan. Um, this is something that we've actually been underway with for almost a year now, looking at some data. We can jump to the next slide. We'll get rolling here, I think. So we've got an hour and a half. I've got a lot of data to share with you, a lot of information, but we also have several points where we're going to be asking for your feedback and input. And we also anticipate we'll have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. You're welcome to put comments or questions in the chat as we go along. We will address those as we can. Probably, if we can't do them within the chat, maybe at the end. But we are looking forward to your thoughts. And I mentioned it is recorded. It will be available. The session will be available afterwards, and you'll hear that there is a couple of ways to participate after this session as well. So what this whole project is about is there's been a transition of transportation planning and engineering for the past decade, really focusing on safety as opposed to moving traffic. The emphasis is more on safely moving people about, whether they're in vehicles, walking, bicyclists, transit. And so the federal government has, in order to encourage communities to look at their transportation networks with this safety lens, they provided funding to do this type of planning, safe streets and roads for all. And so they've provided funds to do that, that the plans, the safety action plans will allow communities to assess their problem areas and identify and prioritize where they want to make improvements and the types of improvements that they want to make. And then that plan makes them eligible for funding to secure funding to implement those plans. So that's what we're trying to do here. Now, all of the regional planning agencies, there's 13 regional planning agencies in the Commonwealth. And this is done across the nation. But the three rural regional planning agencies, Nantucket, the Vineyard, and Franklin County, we decided we'd kind of pool our efforts because being rural communities, we all are concerned about trying to, or concerned about maybe more urban remedies being applied to our situation. So obviously we've got issues with our rural character, but also rural roadways function a little differently than suburban and urban roadways. So we wanted to pool our efforts to make sure we got a consultant team that shared that lens in looking at the data. And we're very fortunate to have a great team. Kittleson and Associates is the lead consultant, but also well facilitated or supported with by Nelson and Nygaard and the DREAM Collaborative. And we have Allison Fletcher is our main contact for our area and for Nantucket as well. And she's gonna shoulder the burden of this presentation, and I'll hand it off to her at this point.
Thank you, Bill. And also my colleagues, Drew and Zach, are going to shoulder a lot of this, but I'm going to get us started as the project lead for the Martha's Vineyard component of the project. This is a schedule of what we've been up to and the scope of this project and some of the activities which we'll give insights on as we go through the presentation here. We kicked off this project in collaboration with the consulting team and the 3 different agencies back in January of 2024. We collected data, we did a lot of data analysis. We started looking through what are the potential directions of things that we could go into. And so today we want to understand and explain to you some of the crash analysis trends and some of those treatment tools we're looking at as we understand which areas are there of concern and how we're going to apply some of those treatments to the areas of concern. We'll move into writing the safety action plans this year so that they can be published later this summer, come back to you with a draft plan. And there'll be many opportunities for online engagement as well, which we'll get into closer to the end of the meeting. But wanted to use this meeting as an introduction to what this process is, what we found, and get into just the safe systems approach that Bill was hinting to that's been backed by federal funding as well as local funding as we go into this. So on the next slide, this is just talking about where we're at with the safe systems approach. Traditional safety principles look at particular types of metrics, and new safe system principles are looking at a planning process that looks at it just a little bit differently. This recognizes a shift in the way that we think about safety when it comes to roadway safety. It's moving away from traditional principles that treat all crashes as equal, and we look for ways to enforce and teach individuals to behave more safely where we react to crashes where they happen. And instead, this project looks at a set of safe systems principles that are more realistic. They recognize that people make mistakes. Our role is to use design, enforcement, post-crash care, and decision-making systems that create a safety net to prevent the crashes from having severe or fatal outcomes in the first place. So we're looking at how is there shared responsibility, how are we reducing the impact, and how are we being more proactive rather than reactive about the way that we're responding to crashes that happen in the streets. On the next slides, we recognize, that it won't be that humans aren't perfect. Things are going to happen in the roadway, but the safe systems approach is more forgiving because we're looking at it from a number of different lenses that incorporate interlocking approaches and create a net of different ways that we might catch or prevent these things from happening, whether that's through the type of vehicles that people are operating, how safe are those, whether it's the speed at which people travel, because the velocity and physics of how people travel affects the outcomes of a given incident, whether it's about the culture and the education and the knowledge of the local geography and what people that might be traveling or visiting bring to that, and how people are cared for after the incident, how they're connected to the response that happens after, how are the information systems, what happens after the crash, what's the culture of that, and then ultimately also what is the shape of the roads, the number of lanes, the width of the lanes, and other geographic factors of the road have a very large impact in terms of the likely outcomes of any given incident, and we'll talk a lot about those when we get later down into the presentation. Before that, we wanted to just give you a bit of insights into where we're headed. So kind of building on the schedule that I gave a preview of earlier, we've been in the business of identifying high crash locations, developing a network of where those are. And then we start looking at the crash factors of like, okay, what are the trends of the things that are happening on the vineyard in terms of crashes? Then we use that to move towards what are the countermeasures that can reverse the particular distinctive trends in your geography to develop potential projects. And then we rank and prioritize those and create a safety action plan towards implementation. But before we get into all of the data analytics, we want to give you an opportunity to engage. You can engage with a poll as part of this meeting. This is called a Menti poll. Some of you might have used this in other meetings that you've been in. So if you're participating live online, you can either take a picture of the QR code or you can type in menti.com and use the code 57311660. We'll also put that in the chat here so that you can go to the webpage if you would like to do it that way. But we want to give everybody a few seconds to get into the polling thing, because we're going to have a number of polls as we go through the meeting. These are more warm-up ones to make sure that you can use the polls, and then later on we'll get into some safety preference questions from you. So on the next slide, and you can take your time to log in. The first question is just understanding what town on the vineyard you're joining this meeting from, or are you joining from off island? So we'll give you some time here to enter the Menti code, enter the numbers, and let us know. So I can see some people are already getting into it. We have about 13 people in the meeting today, so we may get up to 8 or 9 responses from people that aren't the people administrating the meeting, but if you need to use the Menti, you can just put your votes in now from where you're coming from. We have one from Edgartown, one from Tisbury. probably expecting a few more responses if you'd like to participate. The way that Menti is also set up, if we move forward to the next slide, you also can continue to respond to some of these questions in the background and then just keep going through them at the pace in which we're using them in the meetings. Does anybody need any clarification on how the Menti works? If so, put it in the chat, but I think we can probably just keep moving forward through the warm-up questions. So the next question is about your relationship to Martha's Vineyard. Are you a year-round resident? Are you a seasonal resident? Do you work on island or reside off island, or are you a visitor? Do you fall into any of these categories? I see a few people have already chimed in. All right, so I think we just have a few people participating in the survey, so we probably can move forward to the next question. We're curious about your primary mode of travel on the island. Many of you may have multiple modes, but we're curious, what is your primary mode on a day-to-day basis? Are you driving? Are you walking? Are you biking? Are you taking transit? Are you riding a motorcycle or a scooter? Are you using a wheelchair device? See some of those responses already coming in. Any other input? For those that came in late, we can also type in the Menti code again. It's also at the top of the slides here, but if you want to copy paste, it's in the chat here. Great, we have a few more responses here. And then we just have one more warm-up question before we get into some of the depths of the analytics. So the next question is about, just curious, maybe if you don't walk or bike regularly, if you do, what times or months of the year do you walk or bike most regularly along the vineyard's roadways? So you can just enter your poll responses now. Great, we get some people, in the warmer months, spring to October, which are usually warm. Some people year round. It's great. Okay. I'll give it just a second for a couple more responses, and then we're going to move into the next section of the presentation. All right, I think we probably have all the responses we'll get for now. If you join later, you can also continue to do the questions that lead up to the one that we'll get to later. But I'm going to pass it over to Zach to talk about the crash analysis and what we've been finding in the data for the vineyard. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison, and good evening, everyone. We're going to spend probably the better part of the next 20 to 25 minutes just talking through some of the trends in the crash analysis that we've seen island-wide. And part of the Safe Streets and Roads for All program is really to look at a data-informed approach to how we're prioritizing roadways and thinking about where we need to make safety interventions. So a key part of that is looking at historic crashes. And so the first step in that process is just identifying where those crashes have occurred. And so just to begin with where we're getting our crash data from, our data comes from Mass DOT, and it's reported by the local police and the state police on the island. So we're working with the data from local law enforcement, and we're looking at the years 2018 to 2022 for this analysis. That's the most complete data set that we have. We recognize that there have obviously been crashes that have happened since that time. But that's the most significant data set that we could use at this point. And it is worth noting that the crash data that we have might underreport lower severity crashes like fender benders. Say you're parked at State Beach, someone sideswipes you, gets out of the car, you apologize, everyone agrees that you're good to go. That's probably not going to be captured in our crash data. Same thing for near miss incidents. So say you're walking and a car gets dangerously close to you. We're not going to be able to capture that, but we recognize that those still are safety concerns. And so part of our work is to look at this from a data-informed approach, but another part of it is to use opportunities like this to check in with you all, to understand what the local safety concerns are, for you to fill out the online survey and the online maps that we'll do at the end of the presentation so that we can hear more about your stories of roadway safety across the island, and we can help build that into our final work. The goal really is for us to focus on fatal and serious injury crashes, as Allison was alluding to earlier. we recognize that people make mistakes, but we want to make sure that those mistakes are not light. Emphasis on the analysis that we did is really to focus on those crashes that result in the most severe outcomes. And just to highlight, there is a full crash analysis memo on the Martha's Vineyard Commission website if you're really into this and want to learn more about the work that was done to bring some of the findings that we're going to present tonight. There's a more detailed document there that you can take a look at. So just to underscore, the vast majority of crashes that are occurring on the island right now are not resulting in any form of injury, but there are 186 crashes in the average year that do result in some level of injury. And what we are seeing across all 3 rural jurisdictions is that the rate of fatal and severe injury crashes is higher than the statewide average. So on Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and out in Franklin County, the rates of fatal and serious injury crashes exceed the statewide average. And so what does that mean when we really start to dive into it a little bit more? What we're seeing is over time that the total number of crashes on the island is slightly declining, but those crashes that result in injuries have been relatively stable. And it's the crashes in the yellow bars at the bottom that we're really trying to focus on, those fatal and serious injury crashes. And again, those rates are comparable to Nantucket and Franklin County, but higher than the statewide average compared to the other regional planning agencies. And so part of the story I think that we expected to see was that crashes would be higher during the summer, and that's certainly true. But what I also want to underscore is that crashes in the spring and in the winter are comparable to the statewide average in terms of the severity on the island. So while the total number of crashes is up in the summer, that does not mean that we're sort of off the hook for the months that are the shoulder season for tourism or the off season. There are still serious incidents that are happening during that time. The only point where the vineyard falls below the statewide average is during the fall, so September, October, and November. You can kind of see that within the chart as well, where the severity of those crashes generally goes down. The biggest trend that we're seeing is that the majority of crashes on the island are only involving a single vehicle. And that's also disproportionately the types of crashes that are represented in the most serious outcomes, so those fatal or serious injury crashes. There's also a larger proportion of pedestrian-involved crashes and bicycle-involved crashes. Notably, bicycle-involved crashes are comparable to Nantucket and Franklin County in terms of the other rural jurisdictions, but they exceed the statewide average. And Martha's Vineyard is actually somewhat anomalous in that it's the only rural jurisdiction that is above the statewide average for pedestrian-involved crashes in terms of the severity. So trends that we're looking at there, trying to understand those a little bit better and then think about what solutions might be appropriate to start to mitigate some of those impacts. I know I mentioned that single vehicle crashes are the most common and the most severe in terms of crash types. You might be wondering, what is a single vehicle crash? So a single vehicle crash is where only one vehicle is involved, and typically it collides with something that's off the roadway, like a tree or a fixed object or a guardrail, or it doesn't collide with anything in particular, but it rolls over, ends up in a ditch or an embankment or something like that. And so where we often see those crashes are on the more rural parts of your roadway network further up island, and we'll get into that a little bit more later in the presentation. It's less likely that those sorts of crashes are resulting in severe outcomes when they're happening in some of the down island, downtown areas, commercial corridors. It's more once you get further out where the island opens up a little bit and feels a little bit more rural, where we're seeing more of those crashes be concentrated. And so I was mentioning earlier that the rates of bicycle and pedestrian crashes are exceeding the statewide average on the vineyard. And so when we look at that compared to the total number of crashes, only 6% of the total number of crashes involve someone walking or biking, but 28% of the crashes that result in a fatal or serious injury are occurring with a crash that involves someone that's walking or biking. So really a stark mismatch there between the total number of crashes and the impact of those crashes on the folks that are involved. So something that we're really, focused on and trying to head off is that impact. You might be wondering where crashes are happening. And so we've put a map up on the screen. I'm going to stall here for a couple of seconds so that you have a chance to look at it and maybe take in the roads that are close to home or places that you know well. The darker colors, the darker brown represents fatal crashes. red to orange to yellow, sort of declining in severity from there. And then those gray dots are crashes that don't result in any injury to any of the people that are involved. So your fender benders and your side swipes. But what we are noticing is that there's dense crash clusters in Tisbury and in Oak Bluffs and in Edgartown, sort of those downtown areas. But crashes up island are a little bit more sparse, but that does not mean that they're less severe. In fact, many of those fatal crashes, as I was talking about before, are on those rural roadways that are up island. And just to caveat as well, there are some crashes that we're not able to map that just as a product of sometimes the reports that we get from DOT makes it such that we can't necessarily look at where those crashes are in space, but we can still understand some of the trends of those crashes and what's happening that may or may not be causing them. So just to zoom in a little bit further on just where those fatal and serious injury crashes are, those ones that we really would like to eliminate. They are concentrated on the higher volume roadways across the island. I think folks, if you take a look at the map, you'll recognize many of the roads that those are on. And it's a lot of those rural up island roads, and then the roads that are connecting sort of the towns that are down island. And something that's notable is that half of the fatal and serious injury crashes occurred on a MassDOT owned road. So there really is an opportunity through this plan for the Vineyard Commission, the local jurisdictions, and the state, to all put their heads together to really head off some of these challenges together. When we look at where crashes involving cyclists are occurring, there were 31 of those crashes in the 5-year period that we looked at, and 2 of them resulted in a serious injury. Thank goodness, no fatalities during that time period. But 87% of those crashes did result in at least 1 injury. And so they are more common in the Down Island area, particularly in Tisbury near the Five Corners intersection, near the Triangle in Edgartown, and in sort of the general downtown Edgartown area more generally. And so we are seeing clusters of these near complex intersections and near town centers, places where you might find it more difficult to navigate as a cyclist, or places where you just would expect more cyclists to be because it's a popular place for folks to end up and to go. So it's a similar story for pedestrians. They are also sort of concentrated. Those crashes involving pedestrians are concentrated in town center areas, and there's a particularly dense cluster in Tisbury in and around that Five Corners area. And there were 28 crashes that involved pedestrians across the 5-year period, 7 of which resulted in serious injuries. Again, thank goodness, no fatalities during this time period. But 89% of those crashes resulted in at least 1 injury. So these are still impactful crashes that we want to eliminate to the best of our ability. Another thing that we heard loud and clear is that motorcycles and mopeds have a unique place on the Vineyard in terms of their impact on roadway safety. And so we wanted to be cognizant of understanding where those collisions are occurring and their severity. So 23 crashes involved a motorcycle or a moped. That's split pretty much 50-50, 12 moped crashes and 13 motorcycle crashes. 2 of those resulted in fatalities and 3 of them resulted in serious injuries. 96% of those overall crashes, so all but 1, resulted in at least 1 injury. So these are generally going to be impactful crashes. And we're seeing that they're more common in Down Island communities, particularly in Tisbury and in Oak Bluffs. But as you get further and further away from those downtown centers, that's where the severity of those crashes is generally going up. Both of those fatalities were in Chilmark. So, just thinking about that in conjunction with the broader conversation about how we're treating rural roads, understanding that there are these variety of different modes that are using those roads and how we safely accommodate all of those different uses. Something else that we found was notable was that 14% of all the crashes over the past 5 years involved a deer. With the state forest and sort of the general conserved area across the island, it's a great habitat for deer, and they seem to be doing quite well on the island. But 96% of those crashes, fortunately, are not resulting in any injuries for the people in the cars. But there is a concentration of these crashes, particularly on roads going up island, like State Road, South Road, seeing Old County on there too, Edgartown, West Tisbury, just sort of those roads that are generally around the edges of the state forest, and then as you get further and further into the rural parts of the island. So something else that we're thinking about is how to mitigate some of those collisions. And while they might not be injurious generally at this point, it's something that we want to keep an eye on. And speed. Speed is kind of the big thing in a lot of the safety work that we do. It's a very basic sort of kinetic energy equation to understand how speed impacts the severity of crashes and the forces that act on your body as you're in a collision. And so speed is something that we really want to take a close look at. And what we're seeing across the island is that speeds are generally higher than the posted speed limit with the data that we have, thanks to Bill and the folks at the Martha's Vineyard Commission. And that while some of those really extreme instances of speeding, 20, 30, 40 miles an hour over the speed limit, are rare, they are extremely dangerous. And so what we're also seeing is that the speeds generally come down in the summer, which I think aligns with a lot of people's experience operating across the island, is that as it gets more congested, people go slower. But as we see higher and higher speeds, the possibility of a more severe collision increases. And so what we're really starting to think about is, roadways like this is West Tisbury Road near Morning Glory. There's many other examples like this across the island. We have data from near the airport, along State Beach, that all shows a very similar trend, speeds that are sort of 5 to 10 miles an hour above the posted speed limit. And so just to take a step back, the 85th percentile speed, which is what this shows, is the speed that 85% of people driving are going at that speed or below. So just thinking about ways to make that a safer environment for everyone, whether it's designing for slower speeds, setting lower speed limits, or enforcing the speed limit more actively, educating folks, a whole host of different countermeasures that we can look at here. And just to really put this into, I think, maybe a bit of a finer point, when you are traveling at a higher speed, your ability to react to changes within the roadway vary pretty dramatically, and your ability to react successfully to something, for example, like a pedestrian stepping out into a crosswalk in front of you, at 20 miles an hour, you might have enough time to react and brake. But as you get further up towards 30 or 50 miles an hour, you might not have enough time to react and brake before you would collide with that pedestrian. And so, the chance of the pedestrian surviving or not being injured in that collision is significantly better at lower speeds. And so we're starting to think about this more holistically, right? How we're designing for all roadway users. And part of that is designing for safe speeds. That's one of the 5 pillars of that safe systems approach that Allison was walking through earlier. So that sort of generally talks about the crash trends. And the thought there is just to sort of walk through a whole bunch of data so that you have a sense of all of the different work that we did. Again, there is that memo that's on the Martha's Vineyard Commission website where you can get into the data a little bit more closely. But part of this exercise is not just to look at all of these trends and charts and graphs, but it's also to make sense of where we really want to focus our effort. And so the next step of the process is creating what we call a high injury network. And so a high injury network is a network of locations across the island that represent the places where the most severe crashes have happened over that 5-year period. And so we're using that network of roads and intersections to try to understand where we want to focus our work as part of the plan. And so that we can think about how we target our work more strategically so that there's really sound investment and smart investment of the resources that might be available to do safety related projects. So as I talked about before, we start with that 5 years of crash data, and then we take that and we pretty much assign it to different roads on the map. We say, okay, that crash happened on Edgartown Vineyard Haven Road right here, perfect. We aggregate all the crashes that happened in similar places together, and we start to look for trends in sort of space across the map. And so what we get to is something that looks like the map that you see on the screen. And so the goal for the way that we created the high injury network was to look for how can we capture 75% of all of the fatal and serious injury crashes over the past 5 years on one of the roadways. So whether it's blue, orange, or yellow on that map, altogether they encompass 75% of those fatal and serious injury crashes. And so there, we sort of split that out into 3 different levels of severity, if you will. The blue roads are the places where we've seen the highest severity of crashes over that 5-year period. And then the second, the orange level, is the next step down from that. And then the yellow is the next step down from that. And that's not to say that the roads that are yellow are perfectly safe. It's essentially, we're starting at places where we've seen a significant number of those incidents and working our way back from there. And so that first tier represents about 10 miles of overall roadway network across the island. The second tier is 33, and the third tier is 30 for a total of sort of 73 miles. So lots of different work to do here, but opportunities to really refine this into focused and concentrated projects as we work through this process. It's like later on in the presentation. And so just to zoom out a little bit, so you have a sense of sort of how we come to that high injury network. It's a combination of those top corridors and also top intersections. And the reason why we think about those two things separately is because we want to be strategic about thinking about the strategies to address the challenges that we're seeing based on where those challenges are occurring. If we have a lot of crashes that are happening along a long stretch of road and we say, well, we're just going to fix all the intersections, that might not really get at the root of the problem. Or the inverse might be true. If we try to redesign a roadway, but the challenge is really a pinpoint at an intersection, we might not be doing ourselves the best possible job that we could to address the safety related challenges. So we're looking at it two different ways here. And while I was talking, I hope you had a chance to sort of look through that list of locations that are on your screen and maybe think about where they are on the map as you know them well. But really what we're thinking about these as corridors of places where we could make safety investments that we would really target some of those fatal and serious injury crashes. And you'll notice that these are generally across all the different communities on the island. There is a slight sort of slightly higher concentration in the down island communities versus the up island communities. But that is not to say that there are not roadways that are worth looking at in pretty much all the communities, actually all of the communities across the vineyard. And then this is more or less the same thing, but now we're looking at just the intersections on the left-hand side. And so you might recognize some of the intersections as places that are near you, near where you live, near where you work, near where you go to the grocery store. But again, the goal is to really think about these as opportunities to do really site-specific improvements and think about how can we reimagine or just reconsider the way that some of these locations work to make them safer for everyone. And so we're not at the stage right now where we're to that point, but we're thinking about how we can use this as a guidance as we start to think about projects. And I will sort of start to wind down my presentation here by talking about generally the trends that we've seen on different types of roads. And so the first stage of the presentation was just sort of all of those charts and graphs, which might have felt a little bit detached from the island that you all know. And so just to walk through generally what's happening on different types of roads on the island. So in your sort of commercial corridors, your village center streets, what we see is a lot of angle collisions and side swipes. So cars that are sliding past each other or crashing into each other at an angle. Also pedestrian involved crashes. Many of those crashes only result in property damage, not the pedestrian involved ones, but the angles and the side swipes. And so what we're seeing is that a lot of those more severe incidents that are happening in your village center streets are involving bicyclists and pedestrians. So really starting to think about how we make those places safer for those roadway users is a key consideration. On your town access roads, sort of as you take one step away from town center, how are you getting in and out of town? What we see is a lot of rear end collisions and crashes that involve people that are not yielding properly at locations where vehicles might be entering traffic at an intersection or just sort of not yielding properly. And so most of the more serious crashes there are are the result of speeds that are too high for the context that people are operating within, or people failing to yield, drivers that are making mistakes as they're operating. And then as you get further out onto the rural roadways in the island, we're seeing a lot of single vehicle runoff road crashes and lane departure head-on collisions. So people that are either veering off the road to the right or veering out of their lane to the left and colliding with oncoming traffic. And some of that is involved in unsafe operating speeds, whether it's operating unsafely around a curve or just operating at a speed that's too high for generally the roadway context of the island, but more specifically for the rural parts of the island. And so we're trying to think about these each as an opportunity to start to hone in on what sorts of treatments might be appropriate in different places, and looking at the crashes in different locations helps us get to that. All right, we're going to go back and do a little bit more polling. So this poll is an open response question, and it's an opportunity just for you to share something that might have surprised you about the crash analysis, whether it's something that really struck you as an interesting finding, something that you'd like to know more about, something that you didn't know before you came to the meeting tonight. This can be helpful for us to start to think about how we can share this message with more folks on the island, and we can make more people aware of what the safety related challenges might be. I know it takes a minute or two for folks to type, so I'm just going to linger here for a little while longer. And as the presentation goes on, if you do have something that really struck you, or as we get further into the presentation and as we start to talk about safety solutions, something comes to mind, feel free to continue to use the Zoom chat to offer any surprises or feedback you might have. Yeah, folks saying that they didn't recognize how many crashes there were, surprised at how spread out everything is. Yep, year-round crashes. Yeah, a question about distracted driving. So we did look at distracted driving a little bit, and the trends there were slightly less conclusive. We do see folks that are unfamiliar with the roads, and there is a trend broadly of distracted driving on the island, but not any one particular type of distraction. When we looked at similar data for Nantucket, for example, we saw a great deal of distraction related to cell phones, and we didn't necessarily see that same level of thanks, Allison, in the chat. We didn't necessarily see that same level of trend here. Yeah, higher levels of crashes that resulted in fatal or serious injuries than the mainland. Yep. All right, I am going to keep going. And so the next stage, just to sort of tee up where the presentation is going from here, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Drew in a minute. We're going to start talking about what some of the different safety solutions are that can address some of these challenges. But we do recognize that safety solutions and safety countermeasures often require trade-offs. And so part of that conversation is trying to understand what the priorities of the community are when we're thinking about countermeasures. So these polling questions encourage you to sort of slide along the scale. Would you rather see roads where you can travel safer or where you could travel faster? And we're going to do a few more of these questions. We understand that not all of them are binary, but we'd just ask you to sort of slide along to see where you feel you'd like to see that trade-off sort of come out. Great. So it looks like folks are sort of generally in that travel safer column, but maybe a little bit of consideration for getting around yeah, cool. Go to the next one. So the next question is going to ask about road conditions versus road capacity. We recognize that there's a finite pool of resources, and so sometimes things like repaving roads and creating better road conditions can be at odds with creating more road capacity. And so just thinking about which one you'd rather see the island invest its resources in. Great, I'll keep going in the interest of time. So the next question is, would you rather have more space for vehicles or more space for bicyclists and pedestrians? we recognize that sometimes those two considerations require a trade-off. So which you'd rather see? Okay, looks like we're a little bit closer to down the middle on that one. Slightly leaning towards bicyclists and pedestrians. Cool. This sort of teases out that a similar question, a question of whether you'd rather see wider shoulders on roads or whether you'd rather keep sort of the preservation of the existing landscape, whether that's trees or rock walls or just anything that would be an impediment to widening the shoulder of the road. Great. Okay. I keep going. I think this is the last one that I have for now. So it's a question of whether you'd like to see the roads be designed for peak seasons, sort of that summer crush load of folks that come over, or for the year-round needs of the island. All right, we are, feels like close to 50-50 on that one as well. All right, well, I will thank everyone for participating in that and for entertaining me as I went through all of that crash data quickly. And I'll pass it over to my colleague.
I'll jump
That we
in.
could do to remedy some of the safety challenges that we're seeing on the island today.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. Sorry for interrupting, Zach. Great job. And we've thrown a lot of information towards you, and we want to share with you what we're going to do with it next, and by way of providing some information about proven safety countermeasures. Where we are in the process on the next slide is, as Zach described, we've got a lot of great data informing the places where we might develop some specific projects for the Vineyards consideration and all of your town's consideration and moving forward, either through grants or ongoing maintenance as street repaving gets done, or through other implementation through programs such as enforcement and education. So we're at this we will be reviewing the crash types that are happening at the specific locations that Zach illuminated during his presentation, and considering which countermeasures are applicable to the specific context in which those crashes are happening. So we wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to hear about some of the measures that we'll be considering as we develop the project recommendations. And we're going to use a resource called the Federal Highway Administration Proven Safety Countermeasure Database. On the next slide, if you can, we use this database because there are the countermeasures available through it are documented to have proven safety effects, and the way that the proven safety countermeasures work is wide-ranging. They can include modifications to the design of roadways, changes in policies or procedures, changes in roadway user behavior through education and enforcement, and all the impacts of the proven safety countermeasures have been documented in studies in a variety of locations, similar to the road types that Zach described. But their efficacy depends upon us understanding the types of crashes that are happening at the high injury locations and at the intersections and segments, the land use context at those places, the roadway conditions of those places, and their feasibility. We think about the proven safety countermeasures, and as we're selecting them in terms of a design hierarchy described by the Federal Highway Administration, this provides guidance for selecting and prioritizing countermeasures to reduce traffic fatalities and serious injuries. The Tier 1 countermeasures are the ones we're going to consider first, because they have the highest rates of reducing the frequency and severity of collisions. Some countermeasures are classified across various tiers because their effectiveness depends upon the land use and the roadway context. And countermeasures can be paired together. In other words, they're not mutually exclusive. Lower tier countermeasures can be effective interim solutions, while larger safety efforts are ongoing because sometimes it can take several years to build up the funds and the design work for the more large infrastructure investments. So the tiers are tier 1, remove severe conflicts, tier 2, reduce vehicle speeds, tier 3, manage conflicts in time, and tier 4, increase attentiveness and awareness. A couple of things about the, thanks, you're great, next slide. So a couple of things about the tier 1 countermeasures. They minimize the potential for conflict and therefore crashes. They do that by separating road users moving at different speeds, thereby reducing the impact of crashes should they happen and increasing the opportunity to prevent crashes by because the potential conflicts can be seen because people are moving at slower speeds. They also prevent road users from making conflicting movements in the same space at the same time. We share a lot of our roadway spaces. People walking along a street, across a street, are using that space at the same time. For example, people making a turn, people driving might be making a left turn or a right turn into that same space. So we want to try to minimize the opportunity for different road users to have conflicting movements happening in the same place. Some of the tier 1 countermeasures that we're considering for Martha's Vineyard along corridors include corridor access management, which might include consolidating driveways or reducing the number of curb cuts that along frontages, installing separated bike lanes, paving shoulders to add room for biking or walking, striping advisory shoulders for biking or walking, installing shared use paths, and installing sidewalks. These are what we call corridor level treatments or countermeasures. At intersections, we'll be looking at installing turn lanes, adding all-way stop controls, taking some consideration of traffic signals, centerline hardening, medians or splitter islands, which I'm going to talk about later. I'm going to talk about all of these later, so I'm just going to talk through them first before we go into more detail. Curb extensions, extend the sidewalk at corners, realigning intersection geometry to make it more orthogonal or perpendicular to all the road users so the visibility is increased, converting intersections to roundabouts or mini roundabouts, and improving intersection sight distances with things like plants or removing parked cars close to corners. So these are the tier 1 countermeasures we're considering, and most of them I'll talk about in more detail with respect to the types of crashes that they reduce. Tier 2 countermeasures reduce vehicle speeds. Slower speeds reduce the kinetic energy involved in a crash and the transfer of energy, large amounts of transfers of energies from, in particular, people driving to people walking or biking do cause more severe crashes. So the slower we go, the lower the kinetic energy is when those two masses meet each other. And also reducing vehicle speeds limits the severity of crashes that do happen. Corridor improvements include lane narrowing, adding speed humps or speed tables, adding mid-block crossings or raised mid-block crossings. Intersection improvements include raised intersections, centerline hardening, median, splitter islands, realigning intersection geometries as I described before, and converting intersections to roundabouts or mini traffic circles or roundabouts. And you'll see, as we mentioned earlier, that these, you're hearing some repeat of the countermeasures between tier 1 and tier 2, because again, they serve different purposes and have different levels of efficacy depending on the roadway and the land use context. The third tier is the management of conflicts in time. In tier 1, we separate users in space. In tier 2, we separate users in time. So people take turns using common roadway space and using tier 3 countermeasures. There are discrete and alternating opportunities to navigate the roadway environment. A classic example of this is a two-phase traffic signal where one direction goes in time 1 or period 1, and then that direction is stopped, and then the other direction gets to go in the second phase of the signal. So some countermeasures we're considering for the vineyard here are along corridors, pedestrian hybrid beacons, and at intersections converting to all-way stop control or installing signals. Finally, the tier 4 improvements or countermeasures increase attentiveness and awareness. There was some concern about distracted driving, and some of these countermeasures are used to increase the level of attention that people have when they're using the roadway. They raise alertness to the potential for conflicts or changing roadway conditions. Examples for corridor level treatments include rectangular rapid flashing beacons, edge lines or center line rumble strips, roadway visibility improvements, speed feedback signs, and increase the quantity of posted speed limit signs, curve delineation signs, striped mid-block crossings, the few in this tier. And then for intersections, installing or upgrading to larger regulatory signs, increasing advanced signage, transverse rumble strips on approaches to intersections, and improve intersection sight distances by removing impediments or blocks to visibility at sight triangles where streets meet each other at an intersection. So we'll provide a little more detail about all that, the list of countermeasures that I just ran through. The first one of the most effective safety countermeasures for people walking is the installation of sidewalks. The benefits of this countermeasure is that they provide dedicated space for people walking. They separate people walking from vehicles and cyclists, which reduces the conflicts between these modes and the potential for pedestrian-involved crashes. So the sidewalk prevents pedestrian-involved crashes and mitigates some factors that cause crashes, including improper driving, departures from the driving lane, and unsafe speed. And for each of these slides, I should give you a little orientation as we rest here. The two columns on the rightmost side of this slide are they will all be the same words, but we've highlighted the types of crashes that the countermeasure is applicable to in yellow with the bold black outline. And on the second column, we've highlighted the crash factors that result in crashes, and the crash factors that these countermeasures are applicable to. So by applying this countermeasure, you reduce the causality of crashes by the factors that are outlined in deep black and in yellow. Whew. Next one, please. Installing separated bike lanes. And this safety countermeasure dedicates space for cyclists of all ages of abilities, new riders, people who are maybe not as confident as more experienced riders included. They separate cyclists from vehicles and pedestrians, and they reduce conflicts between people, between modes, and also reduce cyclist-involved crashes. Some of the crash factors that this countermeasure mitigates are improper driving, departure from the driving lane, and unsafe speed. I didn't give you an orientation to the graphic on the left of each of these slides, but clearly these are graphics illustrating the countermeasure, and in some cases we'll have photographs of the countermeasure so you can become accommodated to what they look like. Another improvement that is that we want to go through is the expansion or installation of shared use paths. The shared use path can accommodate both people walking and bicycling. The benefits are that they dedicate a shared space for people walking and biking. They take less space than separate sidewalks and bike lanes combined, and they separate the vulnerable modes from vehicles, reducing conflicts between modes and the potential for crashes, therefore. So this countermeasure counteracts both bicycle and pedestrian-involved crashes. It mitigates a crash factor such as improper driving, departure from the driving lane, and unsafe speed. Paving shoulders to add room for biking and walking is very common in contexts such as those throughout the towns and connections between towns. The benefit of this treatment is that it provides dedicated space on the roadway for cyclists and pedestrians in locations where the available right-of-way to install formal bike lanes or shared use paths is too small. It counteracts bicycle and pedestrian-involved crashes and mitigates the crash factors of improper driving, departure from the driving lane, and unsafe speed. Am I behind a level? I am. Striping advisory shoulders for, did I already just talk about this one? No.
I think it's similar but different.
It's similar but different. So the paved shoulders and advisory bike lanes have are similar in as much as there's no vertical separation between the driving lane and the lane for walking or biking, but take advantage of situations where there's insufficient space to install the formal bike lane or shared use path. They delineate the space, but they don't dedicate it specifically. The space is available for cars when there are no people walking or biking in the advisory lane. So in this condition that you see in the graphic, you see that the two vehicles passing each other would have to give way if there's to each other if there is a person walking or bicycling by pulling over to the side of the road, because the lane have been dedicated to walking and bicycling when there are people walking or bicycling there. And the width is, well, I'm doing a really bad job at this. The width is insufficient for two vehicles to pass each other at the same time that people walking or bicycling are using those lanes. It's a common treatment in Europe. It is in particularly used on low speed streets that are narrow, so that there's so that this shared space is safe. In addition to low speed streets, also low volume streets where the probability of all those modes being in the same space at the same time is very low. This countermeasure has been shown to reduce bicycle-involved crashes and pedestrian-involved crashes, again, because of this shared space, low speeds, low traffic volumes, mitigates crash factors such as improper driving, departing from the driving lane, and unsafe speeds. Corridor access management and reduction in curb cuts, something a little more familiar probably to everybody here. This treatment makes vehicle turning movements more predictable. It's more clear when drivers are going to be crossing the driveway, at what point of the driveway they would be crossing, especially on on driveways with long widths and without maybe particular dedication with sidewalks or people walking. They reduce the exposure for pedestrians and cyclists as they walk along the frontage because of the dedicated consolidated area where people driving would cross over the pathway that people are walking and bicycling on. Crashes that are counteracted by this countermeasure include angle crashes, bicycle-involved crashes, and pedestrian-involved crashes. And this treatment mitigates the failure to yield cause of crashes and unsafe speeds. And lane narrowing reduces vehicle speeds. Lane narrowing gives the perspective to drivers that the space available to drive is narrower. There's a lot of research that shows as you move from 12-foot travel lane to an 11-foot travel lane to a 10-foot travel lane, driver speed decreases proportionally to those changes. So we look at this countermeasure as a very simple way to reduce vehicle speeds. Another benefit of this treatment is that it reduces the shared use of. It provides an opportunity for people walking to be out of the travel lane. And therefore, people walking and bicycling, though not on a dedicated facility, are not also in the lane that is striped for people driving. And it allows roadway space to be reallocated for other purposes, such as parking, sidewalks, bike lanes, or shared use paths. This countermeasure counteracts rear end crashes, bicycle-involved crashes, and pedestrian-involved crashes. And it mitigates the crash factor, importantly, of unsafe speed. Adding speed humps or speed tables along a roadway supports slower driving speeds and encourages drivers to be more alert to their surroundings. They prevent rear-end crashes and mitigate crash factors of improper driving, distracted driving, unsafe speed, and fatigue. Our next feature is mid-block crossings or raised mid-block crossings. These are provided to where the distance between crossings is large, and it provides pedestrians with safe locations to cross the road with minimal out of direction walking. When they're raised, they can double as traffic calming devices. They counteract pedestrian involved crashes, and they mitigate crash factors related to the failure to yield and unsafe speeds. Gateway treatments raise the visibility of the edge of the roadway. They provide the benefit of increasing the rate of yielding to pedestrians in the crosswalk, and they provide a visual cue to drivers to slow down as the roadway context is changing. The gateway treatment here is some paving and the two warning signs to illuminate people that people might be crossing the street there, and the marked crosswalk. These countermeasures reduce rear-end crashes and pedestrian-involved crashes, and they mitigate some causes of these crashes, including failure to yield and unsafe speeds. Rectangular rapid flashing beacons are signs and lights that flash rapidly when people press a button that they're waiting to cross the street. They have a light that's similar to a fire or emergency vehicle, so very visible to people driving from a distance. They increase the rate of yielding to pedestrians in the crosswalk by as much as 86%, I think it is. It's particularly effective in conditions of darkness. They provide a visual cue to drivers to slow down as the pedestrians or cyclists may be nearby and awaiting a street crossing. So obviously they reduce pedestrian involved and bicycle involved crashes. They mitigate the crash factors of failing to yield, unsafe speed, and disregard of traffic signs. Edgeline and centerline rumble strips are outside of the are aligned or adjacent to the fog lines on the edge of roads, and sometimes they're they can also be applied on the center line, the yellow line that separates the two directions of traffic. They provide a vibration to drivers who begin to deviate from their travel lane. They encourage drivers to be more alert or to be alert again to their surroundings and changing roadway context. They counteract these specific types of crashes, which we've observed on the Vineyard, the single vehicle crash, the side swipe, and from an opposite direction, and head-on crashes. Of course, the head-on if they're applied to the center line. They mitigate crash factors of distracted driving, departure from the driving lane, unsafe speeds, and fatigue or sleepiness. Another treatment on the edge or on the center line are roadway visibility improvements. Here are some in this picture, we see examples of raised pavement markings. The benefits of these visibility improvements are that they provide visual guidance to drivers traveling at night. Another type of roadway visibility improvement is lighting, which can be used to illuminate pedestrians either along or as they're going across the road at intersections. Reflective pavement markings can also be used to delineate curves. They counteract single vehicle crashes and angle crashes, and they mitigate the crash factors of departure from the driving lane and environmental conditions, such as rain and darkness. Speed feedback and speed limit signs. Here's this one on the right gives a driver on the right-hand side of the road in the photo gives the driver some feedback about what speed they are traveling in relationship to the regulatory speed limit that is in place at that location. The benefit of this treatment is that it provides visual reinforcement of the speed limit and the operating speed together. They encourage drivers to slow their speeds to the posted speed limit, which is safer for all roadway users. They counteract many types of crashes, including single vehicle, rear end, bicycle involved crashes, and pedestrian involved crashes. And they mitigate the crash factors of improper driving, unsafe speed, and disregard for traffic signs. Curve advance warning signs, chevrons, and delineators give drivers cues about the upcoming, maybe unforeseen conditions of the road. They provide visual reinforcement of the steepness of or of the upcoming curves. They encourage drivers to slow their speeds to appropriately navigate the curve or the change in elevation. They counteract single vehicle crashes and head-on crashes, and they mitigate the crash factors of departure from the driving lane, unsafe speed, and disregard for traffic signs. The installation of dedicated turn lanes can be useful to, at specific conditions. They have the drawback that across the street, they might increase the number of lanes that a pedestrian is exposed to, but from the driving perspective, they reduce crashes caused by sudden stopping or making turns, like such as rear end collisions, and they can provide improved visibility of oncoming traffic for turning vehicles, and they can decrease congestion. They counteract angle crashes, rear end crashes, bicycle involved crashes, and pedestrian involved crashes, and they mitigate the crash factors of failure to yield and unsafe speeds. Other intersection elements include the installation of protected intersections. Protected intersections provide a dedicated space at intersections for all the modal users, people walking, people biking, people driving. The pavement markings delineate the crossing paths for cyclists and pedestrians, and turn wedges, which are the turn wedge is kind of the oval treatment in the very middle of the slide. Thank you, Zach. They slow turning speeds and improve visibility between crossing pedestrians and cyclists and turning vehicles. They counteract angle crashes, bicycle involved crashes, and pedestrian involved crashes, and they mitigate the crash factors of failure to yield and unsafe speed. Realigning intersection geometry is something that we're looking at in multiple locations that have wide or Y-shaped intersections with the main road. The benefits of looking at these intersections and realigning their geometry to be more kind of right angle is that the intersection angles closer to 90 degrees, improve visibility, and result in safer turning speeds and more predictable turning movements. In addition, they reduce the crossing distance along the road for people walking and bicycling because there's a shorter exposure to the movement of coming onto or off of the main road. They counteract this treatment counteracts angle collisions, rear end collisions, bicycle involved collisions, and pedestrian involved collisions, and mitigate the crash factors of failure to yield and unsafe speeds. Centerline hardening medians and splitter islands are installations that are put in the center along the center line of the roadway where there is space for two opposing lanes of traffic to go past each other, but with something in the middle, keeping them more separated from each other. This example of the raised median is installed, you have at Old South Road, that exists on Old South Road on Nantucket. By putting something in the middle where a pedestrian can wait, a pedestrian can make it, the traffic will be slower, and also provides an opportunity for the pedestrian to make a two-part crossing, to look one way for a gap in traffic and move to the center of the road and then pause there and look for a gap in the other direction. Vertical delineation at intersections result in safer turning speeds and more predictable turn movements, and the median, as I described, can make it easier to cross the street, but also prevent head-on crashes caused by vehicles crossing the center line. So the types of crashes that these hardening treatments on center lines reduce are angle crashes, side swipes, and head-on crashes, and also pedestrian involving crashes, and they mitigate the crash factors of departing from the driving lane and unsafe speeds. An intersection-related countermeasure here is the installation of a roundabout or a mini roundabout. Here's an example of roundabout at Barnes Road and Edgartown Vineyard Haven Road. The benefits of roundabouts are multiple. They promote slower speeds on approach to the intersection and through the intersection. They eliminate many conflicting movements, and they reduce delay and congestion both. They counteract angle crashes, rear end crashes, bicycle involved crashes, and pedestrian involved crashes. They mitigate the crash factors of improper driving and failure to yield and unsafe speeds. And from an operational perspective, can increase the capacity of an intersection compared to an intersection managed with stop signs or a traffic signal. Another intersection treatment is to convert two-way stop controlled intersections into all-way stop controlled. This has the benefit of slower travel speeds through the intersections as vehicles accelerate from 0 to 0 miles per hour at the start of the intersection, as opposed to moving straight through it at their travel speed along the midpoint of the corridor. And they reduce the needs for proper driver judgment to navigate gaps in traffic on the conflicting streets. They mitigate angle crashes, rear end crashes, bicycle involved crashes, and pedestrian involved crashes. And they counteract those types of crashes, and they mitigate the crash factors of improper driving, failure to yield, and unsafe speed. Installation of traffic signals is another treatment that we're considering in the safety action plan. The benefits are they promote orderly movements through the intersection and reduce intersection conflicts. They reduce the severity and frequency of crashes, and they provide dedicated crossing times for people walking or bicycling. I should say that reinforced throughout this whole presentation that these are countermeasures that are in consideration, none of which have been decided to this point, but just wanting to raise the awareness of all the countermeasures that we're considering. Traffic signals do counteract angle crashes, bicycle involved crashes, and pedestrian involved crashes, and they mitigate the crash factors of improper driving, failure to yield, and disregard for traffic signs. Our next treatment is the improvement of intersection sight distances. Thank you. So the intersection is a place where the most conflicts happen statistically, and so by increasing the visibility of all the road users who are approaching the intersection, you reduce the probability of crashes. By daylighting intersections, we can support drivers seeing each other as well as pedestrians and cyclists, and having everybody be able to make a more informed decision as to how to proceed through the intersection. Intersection visibility treatments counteract angle crashes, rear end crashes, bicycle involved crashes, and pedestrian involved crashes, and they mitigate the crash factors of failure to yield and environmental conditions. So when the visibility is low because of the environmental conditions, the design support helps that out a little bit. Another intersection treatment that's under consideration is the installation of curb extensions. As I mentioned, curb extensions extend the sidewalk a little bit in closer to the moving travel lanes. That shortens the crossing distance for people walking in the crosswalk. It increases the visibility of pedestrians in the crosswalk and those who are waiting to make their crossing. And a tighter curb radius encourages slower speed turns by people driving, increasing the probability that they'll yield to people who are in that same conflicting crosswalk. They counteract pedestrian involved crashes and mitigate the crash factors of failure to yield and unsafe speeds. Just a couple more. Raised intersections elevate the driving lane as a driver approaches into the intersection where the probability of conflicts is higher. Raised intersections reduce vehicle speeds and improve the pedestrian crossing experience. They are the elevation starts at the beginning of the crosswalk and continues all the way through the intersection to the other side. These treatments increase the visibility of people walking. They reinforce the need for lower vehicle speeds by prioritizing people walking, and they enhance the pedestrian experience by providing a level crossing. They reduce bicycle-involved crashes and pedestrian-involved crashes, and they mitigate the crash factors of improper driving, failure to yield, and unsafe speeds. Another less capital intensive countermeasure that we're looking at is installing larger or additional stop signs or other regulatory signs. In this picture, you can see that there's an orange warning sign for the stop sign that is going to be downstream from the driver heading in this position. It's these types of signs increase the visibility of signs to drivers. They are visible from a greater distance and allow drivers to react sooner or prepare, in this example, for the stop condition. And they're easier to see at night and for those with decreased vision. They counteract angle crashes and rear end crashes, and they mitigate the crash factors of improper driving, distracted driving, unsafe speeds, medical conditions, and disregarded traffic signs. These can both be either warning signs, as is in this picture, or increased frequency of regulatory signs. Finally, the installation of transverse rumble strips on approaches or near path crossings. So in this treatment, the pavement scoring has moved from reinforcing the fog line or the center line to reinforcing something upcoming that is maybe unforeseen through the driver's eye. So you see the scoring of the pavement in the travel lane where the wheels are moving for the cars. The benefits of this of the rumble strip on approach to potential conflict areas is that they provide a vibration to drivers that an intersection or a changing roadway context is approaching, and they encourage drivers to be more alert to their surroundings and often the need for slower speeds. They counteract rear end crashes, bicycle involved or pedestrian involved crashes, and they mitigate the crash factors of improper driving, distracted driving, failure to yield, unsafe speed, or fatigue or sleeping. We've gone through this list of potential elements that we'll be considering as we're developing project descriptions for the high injury locations, but also want to reinforce that this is a wraparound plan for the vineyard, and our plan will also include proven countermeasures related to program, policy, and education. Some examples of such countermeasures include education for new drivers, moped or bicycle renters, media campaigns on key safety topics related to the types of crashes that we're seeing on the vineyard, policy changes such as setting appropriate speed limits to the adjacent land use context or the design strategies, and adopting a Vision Zero policy commitment, perhaps via this planning effort. Programs can include traffic calming and safe routes to school, and enforcement strategies can include targeted speed limit enforcement on those roadways where we're seeing unsafe speeds at maybe particular times of days or days of weeks, and yield enforcement tactics on high crash locations. So our roadmap to implementation is we're kind of getting nearer to the arrow on the right-hand side of this graphic. We'll be working through the particular crash types of crashes that are happening at the high injury locations, drilling down to select and recommend the proven safety countermeasures that best match with the roadway context and the local crash context for the location, for each location, and moving forward towards more refined project development, prioritization, and implementation. And as we head that way, Allison's going to tell us what's about your opportunities for providing feedback about our approach and our outcome.
Thank you. Yeah, also thanks to Bill and Dan for championing this plan, and for Drew and Zach going through all this information so thoroughly. We wanted to really distill what the story is of what we've been seeing in the data in recent years, and what that's saying about island trends, and also try to provide this meeting and this recording, which will go online later, as a resource of what the national research is also saying about how to be responsive to those trends. As Drew was alluding, it's not a like one size fits all. There's a lot of different tools in the box, from infrastructure to soft things. And so, your guidance and your input as in response to seeing all this information is really important to us to understand the rest of the story. So there's a few different ways for engagement. I dropped some of these in the chat, and they'll of course be posted on the Martha's Vineyard Commission page. But there's this forum. This recording will be online. The Mentipoll should open up again after the meeting is closed. And so if there's other people that watch this later and participate, they should be open for the next 2 weeks. And then there's also an online map. Some of you have already participated in this. It got published at the same time that we were promoting this meeting. That's a place where you can drop maps, map dots. We'll preview that in a second here. And then there's also an online survey. Both the online survey and the online map are going to be open until March 1st. So we really want as much participation as possible in the next month on these. These are going to have us understanding what's your experience traveling on the island, how does this manifest for you in your everyday experience and or your visits to the island, and using this as a resource if there's anything you don't understand in some of those questions. So on the next slide, we just wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of what this looks like. And I think after I talk through these two slides, we might have the chance to pivot over to a demo of this. So as I mentioned on the Martha's Vineyard Commission page, there's the Comprehensive Safety Action Plan interactive mapping. There is a layer on it that has the high injury network, the one that Zach was walking through earlier. There's a way to click that on and off. It's on there as a reference, but when you're actually live in the map, you'll see that people have been adding dots, they've been adding comments, they've been categorizing the nature of their concern in many site-specific locations. So once we get these collections of dots and information from you, we'll be able to cross-compare what we saw in the crash data versus where people are seeing different opportunities or wishes with safety improvements on the island with all the new ideas you might have coming out of this meeting. On the next slide, this gives you a little bit of a preview of just what that interaction mode looks like. So when you drop a dot, you double click, all of a sudden this box should come up and you'll be the chance to write a little essay. If you want to, you can put information, that's optional. You can also let us know, have I had a near miss here? Maybe there's something that didn't show up in our crash data, but you've almost encountered a crash there. And so we want to be able to be proactive and understand where are the places where we're seeing a pileup of trends where people feel less safe and maybe something could be done about that as well. You can also let us know what mode you're traveling in this area. Really helpful to get your feedback on that. Zach, do you think we'll be able to jump over to the online map component?
Sure. Yeah. Let me stop sharing my screen, and maybe this is an opportunity as well. If there are folks that have questions in the chat or just general thoughts while I pull that open.
You can send those as a DM to me and or Bill, and we can, kind of go through some of those when they come up. I understand some people that aren't co-hosts can also not do a general message chat there. We just want to give a little bit of a preview of what the interaction is like in the map, just because we work in maps all day, every day, but want to make sure that it's intuitive for everybody to give a little demo. So you can see some of those dots that are already lit up there. And if we could do a potential additional one on there, Zach, just dropping in at a particular intersection so they can show what kind of pops up.
Go to 5 corners. And so you would click on your screen and it'll populate this field on the left, which is, as you saw in the PowerPoint slides, an opportunity for you to provide your feedback, to list out the category of the concern that you might be having, whether it's your walking, biking, driving, public transit. And then the contact information is optional, but it's an opportunity for us to follow up if we do have additional questions for you based on the feedback that you've provided. And this last question down here is near misses. So to Allison's point, we're not going to see near misses in the crash data, but if you do check yes that you've had a near miss at this location, it helps us understand broader trends of where those might be occurring.
Okay, that's great. And then as you navigate back to the slides, I can just orally talk a little bit about the online survey. We've designed it to be pretty short. It gets into some of the same polling questions that we had during the meeting today about what type of resident you are, your mode of travel. There's questions about how relatively safe or unsafe you feel when traveling in different modes. It'll ask you some questions about, what are your priorities? Do you want to put safety for people walking first and other things later? There's also a couple opportunities for open-ended chats. Those will be in questions 6 and 7. And then there's an optional component if you have experienced or been impacted by a crash, whether it's been in the past 5 years or not, and you would like to share stories. We want to take some of that into consideration as we think about what gets couched in the plan that we make going forward. So as I mentioned, the links to these are in the chat. They'll be published on the Commission webpage, and this will be open until March 1st. On the next slide, just getting back into next steps, I'm going to kick it back over to Bill to kind of close out here on behalf of the commission. And we really thank you for your time and attention, whether you're watching this live or after.
Okay, Gil, I'm going to recognize you in a second. Let's see, we had a question. Yeah, from here on, we're trying to get this feedback on all the extensive work that's been done thus far. But to get some additional information and concerns out there through the surveys and the online mapping. But we're hoping to be able to provide feedback to you, the public, on what we've been hearing from folks past or for this session and the coming month or so. And ultimately, we want to try to have a draft of a plan going into the summer that we can share with everyone and hopefully finalize a plan by summer's end. So I saw that Gil, are you still on there? You still have a question? Where'd you go?
Well, a comment.
Oh, okay. Fire away.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for conducting this and to the team for all of the work put in. A question to the team, have you all spent time on the vineyard experiencing traffic, particularly during the summer, et cetera, at these various key locations? Because I think that's critical for you to understand the dynamics as well as some of the unique aspects of driving on the vineyard. For instance, going through Five Corners. I posted a couple of years ago on IT a tongue-in-cheek post about the terror I experienced trying to go from the post office across through Five Corners over to the Steamship Authority there. And so, the question to the technical team is whether or not you've experienced, because I think it's critical to understand the dynamics of how traffic moves and doesn't move there with respect to the physical nature of what you're looking at so far.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'll start and maybe I can also pass it to Zach for a little bit more depth and experience as someone that regularly travels there. But as part of this process, we did do the crash analysis last year, and then we also came down with the technical stakeholders and did a day of observation steered by Bill and Dan to go look at all the top crash sites. And we did some observations standing around with emergency response, with police, with DPW present, and looked at how things were happening in real life there, took pictures and documented some of the patterns and opportunities we were seeing. Zach, would you like to add anything to that?
No, just that I've been seasonal for the past 10 years down with you all. So I know the community relatively well. I won't speak for any of the locals on the call to pretend like I know it better than you, but understand some of the realities of those complicated intersections and recognize that there is both a lived experience component to this and a data experience as well that you can't get without having been there. So that's part of the reason why our team thought it was important to be down there last summer.
And second question, you cite data in the reports about the incidence of alcohol use and speed here being, I think, alcohol use being double the averages away. And how are you incorporating those dynamics into the behavioral elements of what needs to take place in the vineyard, specifically enforcement, and then also judicial follow through? And I've had, the experience of spending 15 hours on Zoom calls with the court with a case with a drunk driver that clipped our utility pole on our road, and I saw just very little follow through there, and actually consequence with all of the cases that came through, and I was shocked by that. But alcohol obviously is a critical issue, and with more potential for fatality than I think most of the other dynamics.
I can
Yeah, I
start.
think that
Oh, go ahead, Zach.
unfortunately, the transportation component kind of stops where the incident occurs and the law enforcement takes over and the judicial system takes over. So yeah, the lack of punishment is discouraging to read the court reports in the papers and stuff, and they're fined, and anyway, it's discouraging.
Well, my last point is, I think with respect to traffic and flow, and I had actually considered putting in a recommendation before I was aware of this, as to an all of Vineyard program to deal with it, including law enforcement, including the judicial system, et cetera, with respect to behavior here that I think is critical, both positively and negatively, in terms of an effective program. So to me, the physical nature of this is one part of it, but it's only one part, in many respects challenging to change there with the traffic circle dynamics and the length of time that it took to get that accomplished. And it strikes me that we need to look at all of these dynamics to deal with the behavioral aspects of traffic issues and crash issues. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you that there's the educational component there that has to meld with any sort of physical improvements. Richard, do you have a question or a comment?
I have a comment, yes. I think that the Vineyard has reached its carrying capacity. I mean, this time of year, it's great. The next 2 weeks will be the least amount of traffic you've seen on Martha's Vineyard, but then it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. Widening the roads, increasing, the capacity is not going to solve the problem. I can't believe how little police enforcement there is about improper driving, mostly speeding, but running through stoplights and not stoplights. I'm sorry, thanks. I don't want to see us have any more stoplights, any stoplights at all. Stop signs, I meant. It's just a matter of enforcement. I mean, we got to pay for the police, but I think if we start cracking down, most people are going to stop paying attention and be more aware of the danger that they're creating. But this is a great report, and but we can only do so much. We don't want to have super highways on Martha's Vineyard. That's not going to help. Maybe the number of cars that are allowed over here should be looked at too. If you can't get through 5 corners, you can't get through 5 corners. There's no place to go. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate you all for attending. Thank you, team, for a great presentation. It's a lot of material, a lot of work behind it. And I encourage all of you to look at the survey that allows for more information for you to contribute more information. And then also look at that online map, and you can get down to the granular and not only point out problems, but you can offer you what you think might be solutions. But one other thing is that, don't know if Zach mentioned that you can go on there and see all the other comments and see what people have said about different locations. So it may be that someone is proposing to put a stoplight at a certain location, Richard, so you can say, hell no. Again, thank you all. This will be recorded and available online. So thank you again. Have a good evening.
Thank you all.